Hello everyone, today we talk about late 14th century Castile and in particular the aftermath of the Battle of Aljubarrota in the defeated realm of John I. Right? This was a pivotal moment not just for Portugal that had won the battle but for Castile as well. For those who do not know about the Battle of Aljubarrota, we'll make a video about it, possibly multiple ones connected with it. Also our more usual tactical analysis from the sources, etc. But this clash was fought on August the 14th, 1385. It was a pivotal clash in particular for Portuguese history, as we illustrated in our video about medieval Portugal, as the affirmation of this the westernmost Iberian monarchy really takes place after this pivotal moment. It wouldn't be sort of the last moment of trouble for Portugal that had to struggle against Castile, having historically emerged actually from a county within the same kingdom of Castile and Leon. This clash happened near the village that gave the name to the battle in central Portugal. And the battle occurred during a succession crisis. As you know, following King Ferdinand I's death, leaving no male heir, leading to a dispute between John, Master of the Order of Abbots, and King John I of Castile, married to Ferdinand's daughter Beatrice. The Portuguese, led by Nuno Alvares Pereira, faced a larger Castilian force, including French knights. Despite being outnumbered, the Portuguese utilized careful positioning, terrain, that combined with the effectiveness of the English longbowmen that were from their side. This is notoriously an encounter of the broader, at least of the proxy, but also direct intervention of the French and the English in the Iberian Peninsula, in what was in fact the War of Castilian Succession, to secure a decisive victory for Portugal. The battle's outcome was crucial for John I's claim to the throne, ensuring Portugal's independence and establishing the House of Abbots' rule until 1580. If you're confused, they were called the same way, but it's Joao and Juan, the namesake, in the respective Iberian languages. The battle is interesting in many ways. There is the Carrinho, the Bois formation, for example, that stood out, etc. In any case, Aljubarrota marks this symbol, say, of national pride and military prowess in Portuguese history that was in great part secured in its existence by this clash. Today, however, we'll look at the loser's side, the aftermath of the battle in Castile. Because following the events of 1385, both kingdoms definitely turned page, and they had to readjust also the legitimacy of their monarchy in different ways. Today we talk about John I, who ruled as King of Castile between 1379 and 1390. He had actually claimed victory in the Battle of Aljubarrota, so it would be clear when explaining how the battle went. In any case, there was a great deal of, as you understand, like political, ideological, and even religious struggle at play. Right? John I and his supporters had framed the monarch as a sort of messianic figure that stemmed from the imperial nature of Iberian power that especially the Castilians, as the strongest monarchy in the peninsula, had cultivated, especially since the conquest of Toledo, the cornerstone for the domination of all the region. And we are in the 11th century, so a lot of water has passed under the bridges. However, the self-representation of especially the Castilian monarchy as the de facto hegemonic power in the Iberian Peninsula had brought to develop accordingly a certain imperial universal ideology that, as we explained also in recent videos about, for example, the Umayyads, had been already proper in Spain, or in fact the emirate, later the caliphate proper of Cordoba, made an entire video years ago explaining this sense of universal control over, again, this region that is vast, is enormous, and a bit on its own. Last year I made a video about the Spanish and Portuguese armies organization, this time in history, especially looking at the aforementioned French and English intervention, not just in a strictly, say, operational sense in the peninsula, but also in terms of influence in the development of the local military, that, as we will see now, reflected the relatively unstable political and institutional picture of the Iberian monarchies. There's been quite precocious in many ways. They were among the great Western feudal monarchies, but in many ways they had been lagging behind due to reasons that I will not now simply digress on, but that we have already observed in different videos about, especially the Castilian monarchy and the continuous civil wars, the overall struggles for the control over this immense territory, by the way, that Portugal exploited, especially during the 14th century crisis. We are exactly in the aftermath of the Black Death, etc., in order to secede properly from this kingdom. The Portuguese had been recognized as a monarchy on their own by the papacy since the 12th century, but the Castilians objectively were still up to this point capable of reconquer Portugal, re-annexating it at least to the Castilian crown. And these battles, they're not the only ones we've seen. The Battle of Toro, for example, was fought in the 15th century. It's yet another great victory that the Portuguese managed to pull off. It's a very interesting military history. I want really to cover this more in depth, because Spanish Iberian warfare at large is rough, right, and quite interesting, and also fairly well documented, so that there is always something more to add. So of course the spirit, say the messianic proper aura that had shrouded John I came to an abrupt shrink after this test by God that was the same battle of Aljubarrota and all what it had entailed for the unity of this Spanish empire rather than monarchy. It was now instead the Portuguese who attributed to their king a messianic mission for their own country, for their own nation, while John, I would say one because the other is Joao, this is the same, it sounds as if they were the same people, having suffered a defeat, not just lost a battle, but also this aura of invincibility, of divine favor, and found himself in very critical moment for the stability of the same Castile. After this immense investment in the war, by the way, this international, relevance and scale of the War of Castilian Succession that we will see also better in previous, for the previous part in other videos. Peter I had been beheaded. I mean, the pretty brutal things had occurred also because of the French and English presence in the country. John I's mission at this point was to consolidate what he had, right? To bring it back together, avoid a collapse. In the wake of his despair post Aljubarrota, John banned the portrayal of the Castilian king as the King of Kings. That was yet another reference to the imperial nature of Castilian power. This was at least one of the prides, let's say, of the Castilian crown that now evidently could simply not be displayed, paraded anymore. At least he sought validation elsewhere. John was a practically minded and precise person. He thought out his policy in different aspects. During the Cortes held at Segovia in 1386, he sought new sources of royal inspiration and celebration, grounding his legitimacy at this point from a genealogical point of view, and specifically claiming his own ancestry to have stemmed, historically, from Fernando de la Cerda, the eldest son of Alfonso X, the great 13th century universal ruler, legislator. It was just like, I don't know, the Spanish Stupor Mundi in many ways, that had so much founded Castilian name, through his mother, Juana Manuel, rather than his father. This aspect was quite interesting because it really was a forgery, really. John I of Castile did not descend from Fernando de la Cerda because he was the son of Henry II of Castile, who was Fernando de la Cerda's uncle, and not his direct descendant. Hence the problem, right? This was actually a very shaky claim that wouldn't simply fool anyone. It's interesting to show how important dynastic legitimacy served the purpose of feudal authority in the consolidation of Castilian power and institution. Right? He had at least this being recognized while rising perplexities. So he found that this is interesting also in a historical and perspective at the time, because as we were saying before, and as we've seen in many other videos, the late medieval crisis brought to further regionalization and territorialization of powers, all right, and enshrining one own's legitimacy into genealogical legacy was evidently at this point aimed not at claiming much of a universal rule over the entirety of Spain, but specifically for Castile. There was some of it, again, because Alfonso X had represented the peak of Spanish universalism. He was defeated at different levels, but he had been a great monarch, and as such, this could be a further reinforcement of at least a Castilian stability, even in the face of such a clamorous defeat like in 1385. In addition to this, John expressed a commitment to ecclesiastical reform, which seemed appropriate, at least in the measure by which the country had not won God's favor, maybe shifting away from his own personal responsibility at the head of that. He also hinted at the religious obligations of the Christian monarchy, which were articulated in the significant measures outlined in 3 tracts released at Briviesca the following year, 1387, stemming from the belief that enforcing moral law was the responsibility of the monarch, which was a bold claim even for the 14th century, particularly in the context of the schism that had disrupted papal authority. We're talking about the great schism of the Western Church, began in 1378 and lasted until 1417, that involved a split within the Catholic Church, where 2 and later 3 men simultaneously claimed to be the rightful pope, leading to significant political and religious turmoil across Europe. The Briviesca measures proposed punishments for disobeying children, reforms for clerical concubinage, and strict separation of Jews and Moors. These are also relevant measures in order to found further societal control, hierarchy, precise separation. It all looks like an unfolding of the previous sort of more universal, more expansive, and in this sense less regulative system that had existed before. Say, again, the Black Death changed everything. Castile, we are here in the mid-80s of the 14th century, was so different from the time of the King Alfonso XI that had ruled between 1312 and 1350. in that moment, in many ways, like the system still held. There were signs of shrinking, of further problems of sort of stagnation and even decline. But Black Death and all the issues that had broken out from that, including also the French, the English intervention, the age of the free companies. I have some videos incoming on that. Had ravaged the country, had exhausted it, and now, especially considering the size of it and the recent blow suffered by the crown, it was imperative to tighten the grip on the political and the social picture. By the way, the fact that the papacy was in trouble, or at least the fact that this that the schism brought to a general contest, right, that witnessed Castile, by the way, to support the Avignon papacy at this point. So technically not really allowing for the natural coming back of the Curia to Rome, right, regardless of the anti-popes and all what happened in between. This is relevant because Portugal was one of those countries that supported other candidates compared to Avignon. And here there are no obvious alignments. I realized something horrifying, that is, in over 2,300 videos, never made one about the Western Schism. And I remember it's from multiple years that I'm thinking to do it, but in one or another it hasn't spawned yet from the cycle. I end up talking about it through this sort of transverse perspectives in other videos. But it's important because, it places Castile on a certain international level of gaming that we will see better from an ecclesiastical point of view, but that in this case felt from the Spanish perspective as, now we have a way to consolidate ourselves, even gaining the upper hand, or at least greater control over ecclesiastical matters, regardless of what Rome says, given that there is a schism going on, and it's quite not just a big deal per se, but it's also a moment that underscores the crisis of the church, the difficulties of the church. I just recently made a video about the Hussite, so you know that in these generations there are lots of issues that even paved the way to even some kind of proto-Protestantism. At least this wouldn't happen in Spain, but remember that the papacy had sort of demanded control on Iberian ecclesiastical affairs in exchange for help, especially against the Moors. And after the 13th century, things had become relatively sort of less pressing for the Iberian churches, regardless of course, also the intertwinement with Italian politics, especially for Aragon, that in this case sided with Castile as far as the schism was concerned. Again, all things we will look at in other videos. But going back to John, in order to address long-standing issues that had afflicted Castilian society, as it's described by one Ruiz, the archpriest of Gitanis Libro, the Buen Amor, the Book of the Good Law during Alfonso XI's reign, that had, as you understand, been epoch-making, had been very long, had founded an important degree of, balance. Now, simply with the mid-14th century crisis, the system could simply not maintain. John embarked on a reform of the Castilian church's economic system, specifically. This occurred at the Cortes of Guadalajara. By the way, a little word for Juan Ruiz. This was a medieval Spanish poet and cleric renowned for the aforementioned work. He had been born around 1283. He had passed away in the same year of Alfonso XI, so he was fully part of that generation that documented and sort of criticized the current affairs. His life included a possible imprisonment reflecting also the political and or satirical nature of his writings. His masterpiece is a blend of poetry, prose, narrative, humor, and satire, exploring themes of love, both sacred and profane, while critiquing the society and clergy of his era. Hence, the sort of mockery of indirect of Alfonso XI's reign. This seminal work uses various linguistic styles and forms, making it a cornerstone of Spanish literature. Now, reforming the church, especially from an economical point of view, was quite relevant because, as we've seen also in other videos, the Castilian church in particular had an enormous power, right? It had fully bought in the eminently feudal character of Castile, right? Portugal was similar in that. Aragon was slightly different. But to make long story short, the Castilian bishops were massive landlords, and the defeat of Aljubarrota in part had been connected with the historical difficulties of putting together such enormous forces and adequately sort of uniforming their administration, hence increasing the power on the crown on this massive estates and so on. So it's really a politically hot topic. This was an opportunity, however, for the same Castilian bishops to be further co-opted within the local, the monarchic institutions. In fact, the ambitious initiative enjoyed support from prominent church leaders, including the Archbishop Pedro Tenorio of Toledo. So there you have again if not the most important spiritual center of Castile, there is Santiago that is more important. I made some videos about the various monastic chivalric orders, by the way, of the Iberian Peninsula at large for the military dress video if you're interested. But still, Gutierre Gomez de Toledo, the Bishop of Oviedo instead in the north, whose diocese received the county of Noreña after the exhaustion of Alfonso Enriquez, the illegitimate son of Henry II. John's father had many such illegitimate children. Similarly, John supported the Carthusian order, newly established in Castile, which was an old connection the country had had with France through donations, foundations, also in fact across the Pyrenees, and that contributed to mostly, like, as you know, almost a specialty of land management and, in fact, an estates administration for even warhorse breeding and so on. We'll see now how feudally equestrian, but in an archaic sense, Castile is compared even to the much more drilled English and French companies of men-at-arms. I explained that in the video about Spanish and Portuguese army organization. Because everything was very... this was a big, powerful kingdom, but it was also much... Like, this was true for the Iberian Peninsula, especially the Portugal, Castile, less organized compared to other Western monarchies. Right, they had received less input in, especially the need of a compaction of power since the beginning. Mostly, this had occurred also because of the fast takeover of southern Spain during the Reconquista, almost all in a blow. So this was such an issue for France that had to reform her army from a century to another during the 100 Years' War, but still with high standards. Can you imagine for these Iberian monarchies that on top of this were historically fighting against one another ever since they had taken over the south, also in very sometimes indirect or at least decentralized ways. And so we will talk also more about that, because the routine of, say, sending an expedition in the south, countering the Moors that are always looming over the straits, like ready to go back into the Iberian Peninsula. We discussed something about Islamic warfare from North Africa and the Nasrids of Granada recently, is a duty of this Christian rulers, right? Now it was a matter of consolidation, of reform, of modernization, if you want, innovation. John also promoted the Geronimites, contributed to the sanctuary of Guadalupe, and generously funded the Benedictines of Valladolid, contingent on their strict adherence to cloistered life. Valladolid, as you know, before Madrid, was essentially the capital of Castile. The differences between John I and his father were as stark as those between him and his congenial contemporary, Charles III of Navarre, 1387-1425. It's not like they were even too different from, yes, at large, apart from one another. The Castilian branch was a bit more, a bit colder, a bit, more iron-fisted. Charles was a bit more scheming, let's say. He was related to John through marriage. In fact, Charles had married Eleanor of Castile, who was the daughter of Henry II of Castile, making thus John I, who was, as we have seen, Henry II's son, Charles' brother-in-law. And this marriage alliance was part of a broader strategy, of course, to strengthen ties between Navarre and Castile, but there were historical attritions. Charles was very involved in France. I've just started a series about Navarre, so we will see him better hopefully soon. But Charles III opposed his father and namesake Charles II by focusing on remedying the missteps of his administration. He specifically aimed to restore royal finances and enhance administrative processes in Navarre, so exactly what was happening in Castile, different sources compared to the different countries. But as we were hinting at just now, he had sort of bigger plans that involved also the relations between the Iberian Peninsula and France. Charles had strong ties to France through his parentage as the son, in fact, of Charles. That these were essentially Frenchmen, right? And John of France, making him a direct descendant of the same French King John II that had been defeated and captured at the Battle of Poitiers, that we also made a video on. His claims to French territories like Normandy and Champagne stemmed from his maternal lineage. There was a great deal of issues in France considering big inheritances. This is also the period in which Burgundy was made, in which the Navarres had a saying, because they had tried essentially to inherit it in the stead of the other branch of the Valois. Burgundy would become Burgundy. His father's history of switching alliances, in particular from supporting England to aligning with France after the Treaty of Bretigny, set a complex diplomatic stage for Charles III, who navigated Navarre's position amidst French and English influences. And despite his marriage to Eleanor of Castile, so John's sister, his familiar connections to the French royal remained very strong, and that's the field in which he was essentially more interested in. We talked about this in the video about the Duchy of Burgundy. We also recently made one about probably the states of Burgundy. In any case, Charles had been seeking the restitution from the French crown. Some lands that had been taken from his father. He even succeeded, in part, because he obtained in 1404, as he had obtained the rents and title of the newly established Duchy of Nemours that we could talk about for the French Historical Regions series, along with £200,000 from the selling of Schwerpunkt. The first had been achieved by trading the counties of Champagne, Evreux, and Avranches that he couldn't obtain for the rent of the new established Duchy of Nemours. That had been done also so strategically to partly second his requests. In any case, Charles was frequently in France. Otherwise, he could have not properly leveraged all of this. He controlled some of these lands directly. This was also possible given the current madness, as you know, of Charles VI, that had gone insane at a point in his life, but he had lucid spells every once in a while. he would reign for a very long time, during which, as you know, the various factions, the Armagnac, the Bourguignon, began to take shape and do pretty nasty stuff to one another. There is a history there of craziness, of dementia also later in this very intertwined family. I mean, they were the same Capetians, basically, just different branches. Nonetheless, Charles III was the most committed ruler of Navarre to the Peninsular Alliance since the 30s of the 13th century. Recognized for his peaceful and straightforward nature and his steadfast allegiance to Castile, facilitating, in fact, also the recapture of Tudela, Estella, and San Vicente in August 1387. These towns had been seized by the Castilians during the Castilian-Navarrese War of 1378, due to the usual, say, territorial disputes in the northeastern frontier, dynastic ambitions, etc. After Henry of Castile's death, John I, that had just taken the throne, turned against Charles II, so Charles III's father, who had previously claimed the Castilian throne for himself, right? So that's why the antagonism between it. And the war was fueled by Charles II's ambitions to expand influence to reclaim territories like Guipuzcoa, which were under Castilian control but had historical connections to Navarre. So you have always this perennial, we've seen it since the beginning of these reigns. They were all trying to succeed to each other's thrones, to seize countries. Like Navarre was very well entrenched into its mountainous world, but Castile was such a giant, and in part, like also Navarre's ambitions had been thwarted, and some territories had been lost. Right. By the way, France comes back into play again, because in this war, Navarre had strong relations with the country. There were succession issues within Navarre itself, economic interests, and more that, if anything, we will see when discussing that specific war. In any case, now the situation on the Navarrese Castilian frontier had been normalized. There was this issue about Eleanor, John's sister and Charles' wife, who was pretty melancholic, and developed a veritable suspicion over her husband's intentions, fearing that Charles meant to poison her. As a result, in 1388, she took residence in Castile for 7 years. She went back home, her presence contributing, by the way, to the atmosphere of impending anarchy that characterized at that point the minority of Henry. Was John I's son, who ascended to the throne at 10 years old, when his father John suddenly died in 1390. So there is really a strong contrast there, renewed in terms of who has to succeed, which offspring, from which blood, and so on. As the young king's aunt, Eleanor offered crucial support to the Trastamara Old Guard. The Trastamara were the house of Castile. Before, in the 14th century, still was the Ram one, but this was, as you know, the dynasty that ruled until the end of the Middle Ages. During a period, this one of John's death, when Castile was threatened, in fact, by a return to the divisions and tensions reminiscent of periods like the 1290s, then the 1310s. I made a video about the interregnum, let's say, or the actual regnum between these issues. That is the one of Ferdinand IV of Castile, that at some point also completely lost again the country. It was the plague. It was one of the most terrifying moments in Castilian history, right, at large, not just for the kings. And at that point, the same Cortes were a place where basically just a nobleman could come up and say, okay, no, I want to rise to the throne, or I want to act as a regent whatever, and you could even call this parliaments across the countries, but half of it would not even respond to you. So it was one of those moments. This is, of course, far back in the day now, multiple generations, actually a century, in which, however, in which you realize how by that point it's not such a far time, plus there has been the Black Death, etc. You realize these kingdoms, this feudal monarchies, just rested because of this surplus they could gather. If they lost that, if they at least lost the it's a bit like deficit today. Like if you don't have that critical amount of stability that allows you to enforce law on the broader, if you don't have the resources to control the entire country, or at least to control most of it, you're really on your own. You're really depending on forces that do not that are not you properly. So this is such a critical moment. The Battle of Aljubarrota has been quite an issue. Imagine again this important defeat. Another enemy in the west that is consolidating. The king dies. There is an 11 years old son. Right. So John himself had managed to sustain a fragile balance among various factions. He'd actually been fairly capable. But since the disappearance of Maria de Molina, Beatrice of Portugal's unsuitability for the position brought the Cortes to intervene in trying to fill the political gap. Who were these women? So Maria de Molina was the queen consort of Castile, married to Sancho IV back in the day. So we're talking about John I's great-grandfather, right? However, she lived long. She was known for her political acumen and had acted as a regent for her son Ferdinand IV, that you can go check the video about, after her husband's death, while Beatrice of Portugal had been John I's queen consort. Right? In other words, Beatrice was not a Maria in this context, and she was essentially not suitable or capable of taking on the role of political mediator or leader that, comparatively to this moment of great instability, Maria had had 1 century before. Consider that she was Portuguese, all right? So at this point, after Aljubarrota, her foreign origin, or also her lack of political strength or acceptance among the Castilian nobility with this minor son, but without, again, the advantages of a sharper political wisdom, was such a huge deal. The political changes that had occurred throughout the 14th century, along with the rising importance of Madrid in the kingdom's governance, is highlighted by the fact that in the year of John's death, the 123 procuradores from 49 represented cities had the power to decide the outcomes of this Cortes. Interestingly showing how urban culture is, at least as far as the bigger centers are concerned, reinforced with the late medieval crisis, right? It's a bit like in France and with the later Bonneville du Roi, but here we are also beginning of the 15th century. It's almost fitting, at least when there is a process of national recomposition in France that will be more evident. But in general, you see this also in other very urbanized places like Italy, that the crisis actually favors, just like it favors the big, like it favors the oligarchs, it favors the bigger states at the end of the day, those who have stronger foundations to actually go forward. Central Europe fails, Western Europe succeeds in that power concentration, and Castile is included in spite of the issues. The patriciate, just like the feudal elite, wins at large. And we never talked, I think just one of the earliest videos on Schwerpunkt was, I think, the case of Sagun, but for reasons that were more like to say in the countryside and agricultural. But I think never made a video about properly Spanish cities, those are very interesting because they're not sort of developing, especially in these cases, so much as, I don't know, the Italian ones, in part not even like the southern, say the Occitanian ones, at least before they were taken over by the French. But they are substantial. There is an important level of Romanization in Spain, of course, also in the hinterland. These centers have been reactivated. They act as the seat of the Cortes, as we're seeing in this case. They have a place in the Iberian institutional systems. If anything, I made a lot of videos about this topic, like the administrative systems of the major Western monarchies. If you go in the medieval government playlist, you will find them. And you can see from there how these centers sort of consolidate their territorial relevance. They become a bit like the cornerstones of these countries. They are feudal, but they can't remain feudal forever, especially if they actually, as we're making the distinction between Western and Central Europe, again, they actually do step into some actual states. And this is the case of Spain, displaying a great power of the cities, right? That invoked in this Cortes a regency council plan, but they had a saying to do also as far as dynastic affairs were concerned. Initially proposed, however, by the late John I during his attempted abdication back in the day. We will see it, if anything, in another video, ensuring their majority presence 14 out of 24 on that council. Naturally, today we don't talk about old John I's reign, but these events were important because you realize that the cities had a great weight in the Cortes, and they could dictate these terms at that point. Also because the city really goes nowhere. Like a feudal estate at large can't, of course, is very well garrisoned. I mean, Castile is called like this exactly because it's full of castles, etc. But again, that's a more archaic way to go. At this point, the monarchy needs to float over vast expanses dotted with cities connected by the major arteries of the country. So as far as trade is concerned, Castile is a largely continental country, basically gets down to these important connections. These cities want to ensure that Aljubarrota and the succession, say the minority of the king, that do not lead to further sort of territorial disintegration. Nobody is interested in that in Castile, aside from sort of more anarchic noblemen. Now, the takeover of initiative by the Cortes of Madrid between January and April 1391 still showcased the deep divisions within the political landscape, because in fact some noblemen were not really playing the same game. Archbishop Pedro Tenorio's efforts to maintain oligarchical control in this crisis was undermined exactly by impugnating a long-forgotten will of John I, right? That had thought beforehand, like he was an interesting ruler, really. As well as the stipulation from the Siete Partidas that were, as you know, one of the most important juridical texts in medieval Iberia. I made a video about the Iberian legal tradition during the Middle Ages. You can check that out with the Legal History series. Regarding, in fact, the number of regions that were allowed in such circumstances. There is a chronicler, Ayala, Pedro Lopez de Ayala more specifically, who was a poet, a historian, a statesman, and he served under 4 Castilian kings. He wrote detailed chronicles of their reigns, known for their objectivity at large. He authored the Rimado de Palacio, that is yet another satirical poem reflecting on society, right? It could be like, I don't know, Boccaccio or Chaucer, like in a sort of parallelism. His translation from Latin further established him as an early humanist in Castilian culture. And he pointed out that few men within the kingdom could be deemed acceptable by the populace during this crisis followed to John's death. Debates concerning tutors and regents for Henry III served as a reminder of the challenging times of Alfonso XI's minority, Alfonso XI's minority, following his ascension to the Castilian throne in 1312 as a 1-year-old, was fraught with problems, to say the least. Disputes over regency were immediate and intense. The aforementioned Maria de Molina, his grandmother, initially took the reins, but faced opposition from the Infante Juan, Alfonso's uncle, and the influential Lara family, each seeking to control the regency. This led to civil strife, with factions fighting for power, causing fragmentation among the nobility and weakening central authority. The resulting chaos disrupted economical stability, governance, tax collection, plunging Castile into administrative disarray. Moreover, the political instability made the kingdom susceptible to external threats from Muslim states like Granada, which capitalized on the situation to raid and gain ground. Neighboring Christian kingdoms also saw opportunities to influence or intervene in Castilian affairs during this vulnerable period. The assertiveness of the Cortes signified, in the aftermath of John's death, a shift beyond the hesitant constitutionalism of those terrible 10s of the 14th century, when the towns and cities of the Castilian kingdom were fragmented and vulnerable to social upheaval. This was, in fact, a different situation. Fortunately for them, in spite of the general conditions of the country, these centers, as we've seen, had become more important cornerstones of power. The courts were ever more urbanized, right? This would happen gradually also in France. That was a close correspective, especially for such big monarchies. Reports indicated that during these years, provinces in the north of the Castilian kingdom in particular experienced a notable tendency to deviate from central authority, given that these were sort of also the less important areas by then. Like, the core of Castilian power was in the south, like in the center of the Meseta, Toledo, Valladolid, Madrid now. And it was natural, like in Iberian history, we've seen it just recently, that, even in this moment, like the north was the place from which this very monarchies had stemmed from, now would paradoxically want to create problems in terms of autonomy, of decentralization, because they had been habituated mostly to leverage power. Now, when this was gradually descending to the more civilized places, they tried to shift away. This had all an interesting maritime dimension as well, because the aforementioned intervention of England and France in the Iberian Peninsula passed also through the centrality that Castile was acquiring in terms of the establishment of a national fleet on its own. Mostly it was the Genoese that had played the greatest role. This was the case, in fact, for Castile. As far as their own navy were concerned, especially in Seville, right? Given that now the Genoese had opened, right, the Atlantic route, especially, and so having a difficulty to control the northern ports entailed much more problematic relations with the northern, let's say, with England, with France. It was in the south that in June 1391 civil order completely collapsed, however, leading to the siege of Jewish communities, or the Aljamas. We're talking the far south, so Andalusia, right? Popular biases had associated Jews with Peter the First. We're talking about Peter the First. We are looking at Peter the Cruel, or Peter the Just, like had been the king of Castile from 1350 until his death in 1369. He was the son of Alfonso XI. His reign was marked by internal conflict involving the civil war against his half-brother Henry of Trastamara, which ultimately led to Peter's downfall. Peter's association with the Jewish community stemmed from his relatively tolerant policy towards them, employing the Jews in high administrative position, which contrasted with the general anti-Judaic sentiment of the era. However, his policies did not shield the Jews. In fact, the Jewish community from the violent outbreaks that occurred after his death, particularly highlighted by in these years by the massacres and forced conversions of 1391, which were fueled by this mix of religious, economic, social tensions rather than solely Peter's legacy. However, this is the moment in which the Jews of Spain began to feel more directly the heat that they had experienced since the 30s of the 7th century during the Visigothic rule that, as you know, was particularly harsh against the Jewry, to the point that these began to support an external intervention, including Islamic conquest down the line. The downfall of Peter, that had been literally killed during the Civil War, had not subjected the Jews to intense hostility like the one that they encountered in this 1391. All right. The Archdeacon of Ecija, I'm not sure whether I pronounced these names correctly, but this was the fervently zealotic Ferran Martinez, brought to the pogroms of that year, signifying in turn like a bigger problem for Castile, that is to say the total breakdown of any residual authority in the kingdom. This was a massive issue with a minor king that couldn't basically even take action, and under the threat of an oligarchic collapse of the system, especially after the defeat against the Portuguese, and in a moment of such great upheaval, disgregation, also moral confusion in Europe with the schism after the Black Death. These are actually years in which Europe is recovering, right? So ultimately things will go back on their feet, but these moments were really scary, and the Jewish pogrom did not really help the stability of the crown at all. Starting in Seville, where up to 14,000 fatalities were reported, the violence rapidly spread throughout Andalusia, with the north less impacted, telling the truth. And Ayala noted on this occasion that greed, not religious fervor, was the primary motivator behind these actions. We explained it countless times in the videos about medieval Jewry. Essentially, a royal episcopal authority had, by just divine mandate, that has to preserve the Jews until end times, actually to show that the Christians, to have a witness, right, for proving the world, like the Christians were right. And with this, of course, important basis in common of the Holy Scripture in the Veterotestamentary component, brought, and also for reasons of sensible political, civil coexistence and rule of law, to the protection of the Jewry, like the nobility, the elite, always protected. It was the mob that, of course, like also fueled by some complacent aristocrats, etc., would create. But the aristocrats that did not care about the Jews, but cared about acquiring local power in a way or another, allowed for the Jews to be robbed, to be massacred. And the accusation was always the same, since the Jews had been constrained by Christian law into money lending and other, otherwise morally, reprehensible affairs from a Christian perspective that, of course, also handled money, banking, etc., just making the interest figure as compensation for the maintenance of this wealth, like the costs deriving from it. Brought to this ferocious excuse to massacre. With the end of the Regency in August 1393, that, however, brought to a still relatively precarious reign, the personal reign of Henry III began. Henry is known in Spanish as Enrique el Doliente, which literally means the doleful. Right, he would die young in 1406. So quite difficult times in general. We will see in another video. There had been, however, after his rise, the restoration of some order, especially in the south, in the aftermath of this anti-Jewish pogrom. there was mostly an effort from all these components that, as we've seen, were pushing for the stabilization of the kingdom to concentrate action against the dissenting old nobility that was trying to sort of privatize, to oligarchize the system without a strong monarchy. These, remember, in Western Europe, we often talk about Central Europe, but in Western Europe, monarchies do succeed in consolidating power, right? Whichever they are, unless we're talking, I don't know, the Celtic fringe, but at large, like the big Western countries do. By 1395, there was even the reinstatement of the corregidores, so these royal administrators in both Seville and the Basque area that, as we were saying before, had been rebellious in the north. There was also the elimination of the notorious troublemaker, the Count of Norena, we mentioned before, with the destruction of his stronghold in Gijón. This restoration favored members of newly ennobled families who filled the social and political void following the Battle of Aljubarrota. That was a great opportunity amidst the drama and disaster to replenish the nobiliar ranks with more loyal and less powerful individuals. This was done by the monarchy. That's also what the old nobility had resented the crown at this point. It was a bit like Cannae, right? There was a general moral resentment among the older nobility towards the fact that the campaign, the battle had been mishandled, and that this had brought to the death of so many of this older guard. And aside from responsibilities that we will see better in another video, the threat for this older nobility was real. There was also a deeper moral, anthropological contempt towards all those who simply wanted to fill the high nobiliar ranks without having come from that illustrious background and career in the generation. So you understand the tension here. On Christmas Day in 1384, Castilian documents shift from using the Spanish era for dating the chronological practices of European nations, with which the Iberian kingdoms had increasingly engaged. This is yet another very interesting indicator of how, up to that point, we're talking about it for the military, but how much sheltered and a world on its own Spain really had been. Remember before, like, John had stopped sort of employing this term king of kings that entailed this universal imperial authority. The sense that, again, even now during a moment of papal schism, the main issues, let's say now, with main differences with the rest of the West had been to be gapped in some ways, brings to this different the adoption of the Anno Domini, right? Because the Spanish era was known as the era of Caesar, and this essentially counted years from not such a different time before, but from 38 BC, right? Which was the year traditionally thought to be when Caesar Augustus began ruling the Roman Empire, which was actually not the case here, the historical issue. So, say, for example, if the year was 1400 AD, this would have been 1438 in the Spanish era. This is quite interesting. Remember, if you ever study Spanish sources, right? This was an important step further, the opening mostly to this Anglo-French influences that had showed the way in many ways. Consequently, this transition alongside Henry III's later initiative in the 90s of the 14th century can be interpreted as really indicating the end of an era on a broader scale, one in which Spain fully enters the westernized, fully westernized outlook, right, of Western Europe. In a time you can't even talk anymore about the Frankish world, because at large these monarchies had been Frankish in many ways, but in more an institutional, political, internationally active dimension, there are some aspects naturally that are maintained in terms of broader Iberian legacies that would not end. There are some things that really last for a very long time. For example, even if Henry III was the first Castilian king since Ferdinand III to have no illegitimate offspring, which was an accomplishment, not much had changed over the last 2 centuries, right? As evidenced also by the ordinance issued in 1396 that sought to discourage the use of mules. We talked about this in the video about the Iberian armies organization. Apparently, these Iberian countries, regardless of their millenary equestrian tradition, had still problems to organize their estates in a uniform way that could provide substantial amounts of war horses for the royal expeditions. Some kings even fought in these major battles on muleback, which was apparently just like a very barren thing. And naturally, it's not like they wouldn't have, I don't know, the tougher steeds and the war horses of the year. They had, like Spanish cavalry was pretty tough, but their uniformity, consider how diverse and even relatively dispersed all these. Just talking about Castile, this applies also to other countries. But really, how different they could be, what difference in sort of in status, in importance. We have seen this aspect. What do the Basque countries have to do with Andalusia? Like, it's a big question, right? The mule law confirmed, by the way, among the other things, that Castilian society was not just backward in that regard. It had not developed an updated military system yet. They had to imitate the much more heavily drilled French and English men-at-arms. But that by the end of the 14th century, the country was still this fundamentally horse-centered society that had been for centuries. It's not like even this backwardness was making the country less organized for warfare. On the contrary, one of the greatest problems of the Iberian monarchies, and arguably, especially of Castile, was that the immensity, we said it before, of the country had, and the difficulty that its instability had brought to the, let's say, the continuity of a sort of adventuristic, sort of Reconquista style raiding and long-range involvement, as if we were talking about different countries from the north and the south, rather than, again, an homogeneous administrative outlook, right? And that Castile didn't. We were seeing the importance of towns, for example, but they were as a cluster, right? At large, all this culture was very feudal, very privatistic, very oligarchic. It didn't see so clearly, like, for example, France had launched as a series of reforms aimed at centralizing the system further, in spite of being a very feudal country itself, having, however, already tried, like, the spread of some substantial bourgeois administrative level of power that would correspond to an estate referencing to the sovereign, without too many, say, localistic dispersions, and with a strong connection with the monarchy. The same with England, the parliament of which it was a smaller country, was many ways tidier, the geography was simpler. London had always been the most important center, and an older capital, even in Paris. The Iberian Peninsula had been just like the century before, being split between Christians and Muslims. There were large swathes of the territory that had historically just been a massive frontier, right? Hundreds of kilometers in depth. It's just like when you look at, I don't know, the Danubian frontier between Hungary and the Byzantine Empire, say. This did inform, first of all, a more militaristic society, but also one that was so, because did not had not managed to achieve an actual unity. The Battle of Aljubarrota showing this also in terms of strictly, even from the Christian side, strictly political unity, right? That you could have still like one county of one of the major monarchies out there could fully develop as a major kingdom that could contend the power, even in fact with Castile. There is also a longer term perspective. You can look at the reigns of John I, of Henry III, that again today we didn't really look at per se, but as in their continuum, right? If you think about the death of Sancho IV, so if you go back at the video about Ferdinand IV, and 1492, with the fall of Granada, the expulsion of the Moors, at least in a broader political sense, from the peninsula, you realize that there was an establishment that was keeping things together, that in spite of all this important instability, political criticisms, etc., there was a Castile, there was a kingdom. It was the biggest, the most important. It's not like, I don't know, Portugal or Aragon or Navarre didn't have these issues. On the contrary, Castile had this bigger potential. They would in fact be further fostered to an important growth. Like what is interesting in this moment of greater crisis is that it's actually the biggest players that succeed the most. Right? In Western Europe especially, that's very evident. Like the fundamentals of these countries in the centuries had been much more solid than the ones of Northern, Eastern, Central Europe, right? That there's no doubt, right? And yet it's also not such a straightforward picture in a political sense. For example, the same establishment we look at had previously hindered Alfonso XI's own attempt to enhance Castilian chivalry in 1331. This had been the same guys who had refused that broader military reform, by the way, in a time which would have been really important to enact, so that by the War of Castilian Succession, the 100 Years' War in the Iberian Peninsula would have provided the Castilians with a much stronger force, and who knows, maybe at that point Portugal would have been compromised in its existence and independence. That's all something you have to consider. We're talking about who were these people? Well, the usual, the oligarchs, archbishops, royal, even courtier, physicians, masters of theology, falconers, right? Think of this kind that sort of, let's say, had their own ways, right? That eluded, for example, courtly regulation, political norms, right? Acceptable behavior, would take contacts with political enemies of the king. They would have great power on their own. They would at times become, in fact, the very estates that kind of rolled backwards. At least it's mostly like, this is not a norm, because these were actually the closest, by type, the closest people to the king. Also in political terms, but there would always be some kind of exception. It would always be a nobleman that managed to win them over and to do something nasty against the crown. And that's the paradox, that the sort of mobster and sort of imperfectly Stato, imperfectly public mentality and culture that Castile maintained, right? The mules that we just talked about before, like think about these archbishops when they went on war on them, like that's in itself like almost an aberration, almost like because believe me, in the Middle Ages they did care very much about the symbolism inherent to this. It wasn't just a fashion. It's not just something that in Spain was differently perceived. It was surely different perceived to an extent, but not to the point of not observing a sort of shortcoming, right? One that indeed should have not occurred in strictly, hopeful and ideal terms, also for the representation of the crown. And behind that, you find that same imperfection in the political system, in the institutions, in society. Right, in the broader cohesion of the country. This is important, but it's important to tell the story, because if you think about the role of Castile, also later historically, you realize that this was the winner. That at the end of the day, it was a better system than the other Iberian ones, and managed to create, in fact, more power, more political consensus and compaction, to wanting people to invest in it in order to have the other powers to give way in the process. And that's, I think, incredibly relevant. I'm glad we're talking more about Castile. It was a time in which we didn't talk so much about the Iberian monarchies. I'm glad that, especially in the last years, thanks to my organization of the cycle, the sort of the other graftings, like other with the specials, etc., like we managed to confer these monarchies like the adequate. Let's make check. It's not even about Spain. About Spain, we started really doing something interesting. But if we were to look just at Castile, this would be our 13th video. It's not too much, actually. We should have had probably double time. However, this is 13. What about medieval Spain? Medieval Iberia, let's say, better. Well, medieval Iberia 61. Medieval Iberia 61. And yeah, because there is also the early Middle Ages, so it's a bit trickier to a degree. However, we will have ways to fix this if we are good at what we do, and we are especially stable. Nothing will be an issue. I'm glad, however, again, to cover these topics, because you understand how they are essentially revolving around, like, following different specific times, right, of this or that that reign. It's not just about the say a specific time or another. It has really to do with the especially for these countries, the monarchic succession, right? The fact that there is plenty of strictly dynastic history that dictates how the story goes, right? It's incredibly important. That's why we'll have to come back on it. For today, however, I stop it here. I just hope that you enjoyed this video. If you did, please share it. Otherwise, leave a like or subscribe to my channel if you're interested in my upcoming content. As always, I thank you heartily for listening to me. I wish you a nice time and see you next time. Bye.